With both Daggerheart and Draw Steel out on the market now, and their heavy emphasis on power cards, it feels like it's 2008 again with the release of 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons. And that's been having me think a lot about power cards and ability bloat. Hi, I'm Peter, creator and lead designer of Tales from Elsewhere, and this YouTube channel is dedicated to tabletop role-playing game design philosophy, where I try to help others work through interesting design challenges and considerations when they're building their own tabletop role-playing game. And today's lecture is going to be about designing for games that have power cards or lots of abilities that you want to give your players, whether they're martial or magical. So let's open up Excalidraw and I'll present to you some problems and my recommended solutions. So for those of you who do software development, you've probably heard of pseudocode or used it. Today we're going to be doing something like pseudo rules, because I think that's going to be an effective way to explain what I'm talking about. When folks are building an ability-heavy tabletop role-playing game, they're often attempting to bridge that martial caster divide, giving warriors and fighters and barbarians interesting things to do on their turn, cool abilities and attacks, and interesting decisions rather than just, I move up and attack the enemy. This was a big design goal of 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons, where every character class had a lot of cool things they can do every turn. And same thing with Daggerheart. No matter whether you're a martial character or a magic character, you have lots of domain cards that represent all the special abilities you can do. And we really need to hone in on this, because the way that you design these abilities controls whether or not the characters have interesting actual choices turn over turn, and whether or not there are too many choices for them to have during their turn, which can result in choice paralysis. So let's say you've got a warrior class and you've designed some abilities and you're worried about giving them too many or whether or not they have interesting decisions to make. So you make these three. You make Whirlwind, Cleave, and Overpower. Let's dig into these. Now this is, using some very D&D-like language, but again, this is pseudo rules. Whirlwind would do a minor amount of damage in a large area, right? The warrior can spin around and hit a bunch of things. Cleave would do a medium amount of damage to maybe 2 adjacent targets, and Overpower is a huge, heavy swing hitting 1 target. And you could think, well, job well done, I've now given this warrior a bunch of cool abilities, they're going to have such an interesting and tactical experience during combat. But have you really? Now, these 3 abilities are definitely more interesting than just I move up and attack, but when we actually look at these 3, we can see that the use case of each is extremely obvious. When you're facing a swarm of little goblins, you whirlwind them. If there's 2 decent targets, you cleave them, and if there's a single high priority target, you overpower them. If you're facing a swarm of little goblins, you're never going to overpower, and cleaving them is probably not very efficient. You'll always just whirlwind. Accordingly, you haven't really given a player a ton of tactical decisions they get to make turn over turn. You're giving them a bigger toolkit, and that is good, but these 3 abilities aren't really in competition with one another for the player's attention. And that means that this actually requires very little mental overhead for the player. The use case is just so easy to determine that there's not going to be a lot of choice paralysis on when to use which one. Now, let's take a look at 3 different abilities and see how they compare as far as decision-making and tactical choice. Let's say you instead give them Hemorrhage, Sunder, and Daze. These 3 abilities are all single target and all have a different rider. Hemorrhage deals significant damage over time, Sunder reduces the target's defenses, and Daze reduces their offenses in some way. Now, these 3 abilities are in competition with one another for your attention during your turn. And that's because there isn't as an obvious a use case. It's not quite as apparent which to use under which circumstance. Because now, when faced with a challenge, these 3 abilities are in competition, right? We don't know necessarily, just looking at a monster, which one will be the best. We may want to take into consideration our allies and whether or not they'll be helping us fight. In that case, maybe we do want to use Sunder, but maybe the enemy has really high damage attacks, and so we want to daze them to reduce their offense. Or maybe I'm trying to tank them off to the side while the rest of the players handle some other problem, so dazing them would be effective. Or maybe they're not that dangerous, but they're very durable, and so I hemorrhage them to really get increased damage over time. But then maybe on a subsequent turn, when they're still bleeding out from hemorrhage, I can use Sunder or Daze to reduce their combat abilities, so on and so forth. It forces you into a more interesting and tactical decision tree than just simply what type of area damage or not I need to be doing. But at the same time, this is much more mental overhead for the player when their turn comes up in initiative. Now they're going to have to weigh a lot more variables than they were before, and really deciding that can actually slow their turns down if they, say, had 12 of these. And this juxtaposition is why there's not a firm number as to how many abilities you should give a character. There isn't some magic solution to this, because the way that the abilities are designed is so impactful on how much mental overhead using them is. You want your players to have an interesting choice tree on their turn, so that the fighters can feel like they get to make cool tactical choices using their abilities. But at the same time, you don't want to overflow with so much decisions that their turns take a long time, as every time it comes up on their initiative, the circumstances have changed and they're having to recalculate and recalibrate how they'd like to approach combat. To the surprise of no one, a middle ground or hybrid approach is often the best way to do it. You want to give characters options for different problems, right? For obvious things like fighting a group of enemies or fighting a single target, but you want them to have interesting decisions within that use case. And this is where you can start to have a lot of different abilities, and what 4th edition D&D tended to suffer under. By the time you were in the mid to high levels, you could have a dozen or more of these cards in front of you from various class features, race features, magic item features. You just had stacks and stacks of cards, where it felt like you're playing a Magic the Gathering deck. Now, Daggerheart purposefully limits the number of cards you can have in action at once. Your domain deck can be larger, but you can only actually have a certain number of them, I think it's 5, at any given time that are active. So they've purposefully narrowed those decisions. However, some domain cards actually have decisions within them, sub-decisions that you need to make, which do require more thought going into it. It's why there isn't really a number you can give somebody if they're wondering how many is too many. It's so nuanced, not subjective, but it's based on the way the abilities are constructed. Now, to move out of pseudo-mechanics and into real examples, let's take a look at an example from Daggerheart and Draw Steel, because there's another wrinkle to this design if you're worried about mental overhead and decision-making, and that is the amount of text in the ability. Oftentimes you'll see power cards contain a lot of rules text. They'll need to unpack a lot of information, give you a lot of keywords and usage abilities. With Draw Steel cards, every ability has 3 results that it needs to articulate, because you have your 11, your 12 to 16, and your 17 or higher. And because of that, there is a lot to take in on an individual power card. Now, in Daggerheart, cards like Night Terror are just a big block of text. It's kind of like a D&D 5e spell where you'll need to read through all of the text to parse what it does. And if you have a lot of these, it can mean at a glance, unless you have them all memorized, it's going to be tougher to decide on exactly what you'd like to do because they're more complex and they have a lot of text for you to mentally hold in your brain as you assess what you'd like to do on your turn. So that's the extra wrinkle to consider. Regardless of the competition of decision, there's also this aspect of how much of that ability's use can you keep in your head at one time. And that's a little bit more subjective, as some people like me can retain much of their abilities in their heads without cards otherwise, just because I've been playing these games for so long. But it's another wrinkle you should really consider when designing in ability-heavy role-playing games. So to tie that all together, when you're making a tabletop role-playing game that's going to use a lot of abilities, where regardless of what kind of character you're playing, you're going to have a lot of cards or features that you'll need to decide between on a given turn. Make sure that you're taking into account how much in competition those features are for the player's attention in a given situation, and how hard it is for the players to parse that information on the turn. It can be really easy to get caught up in hypothetical gameplay situations and lose the thread on what it's actually like at the table. because I believe you should be designing these games with table play in mind, with your average human, not somebody with an eidetic memory for cards like I sometimes have, but instead think through how fun it will be to actually juggle that Magic the Gathering deck of cards of abilities versus just keeping it simpler, tighter, or less in competition with one another. There's no one right way there, of course. You're going to have to work through that as you design your own game. Well, I hope you found that interesting. This channel isn't dedicated to finding the one right answer to tabletop design. It's about cultivating discussion, and if you'd like to continue that discussion, consider joining the Tales from Elsewhere Discord server. We always have lots of folks working on their own games and engaging in discussions every day like this one. So I'll put a link down below if you want to check that out. We also have a number of other links related to our Patreon and our recent successful Kickstarter that I'll also put in the description of this video. And as always, I hope to see you here next week on Tales from Elsewhere.